Arlene has the ability to take very complex information and put it in a very interesting and understandable manner for lay people to understand. So just like to welcome Dr. Taylor again this afternoon, and she'll be talking again tomorrow morning from 10 o'clock on, and you won't want to miss those talks as well. But before we start, Arlene, would you like to come up and we'll have a word of prayer together to start our proceedings? All right, just let's bow our heads. Our Father in heaven, we thank you that Dr. Taylor has been able to come across here and spend some time with us. We appreciated her spiritual message this morning, and we just pray that you'll use her again this afternoon to bring a message to each one of us that will help us not only in our mental ability, in our physical ability, but in our spiritual journey. Just pray that you'll uphold and use her today. May we each one be uplifted and strengthened from hearing the program today, and be conscious that you have been here too, we ask in Jesus' name.
I don't know why he always talks about the color of our hair. I don't think I have any color. And I save a lot of money not putting any color on it. I have no problem with coloring your hair, but mine doesn't want to take it. I started getting gray hairs when I was 19. My paternal grandfather was pure white at 29, and I used to think he looked so old, but apparently I got some of his genes. All right, I'm going to talk about two quite new areas of research this afternoon. I love the new stuff. Don't mind talking about the old stuff, because I was telling Dr. Grubb, all the years I've been lecturing on the brain, and it goes way back to the late 1800s. There's only one thing that we used to talk about that has been disproven. Do you remember years ago when people used to say that we only use 10% of our brain power? And they'd talk about, your 10 fingers and you use this much. That's been disproved now that we have the brain imaging equipment. We use all of our brains all the time. But having said that, many people do not tap into what their brains could do for them. And in that sense, maybe we use 10% of our creative options. If we got on board, we'd use a lot more. So Dr. Grubb talked about everything starts in the brain. As far as I'm concerned, the brain is what you start talking about when you start talking about health, because everything starts in the brain. Now, here's a little caveat that we have learned. Your brain can only do what it thinks it can do. Have you got it? Say it with me. Your brain can only do what it thinks it can do. Now, how does it know what it can do? You have to tell it. So if you're struggling with something that is difficult for you, then you need to start telling your brain, you are doing this. You can do this. And when it believes that, it'll get on board. That's going to be huge for young people, especially when they're struggling with a certain, course in school that maybe doesn't have anything, it doesn't align with what their brain does energy efficiently. Your brain can do only what it thinks it can do, and you're the one who teaches it what it can do, or not. So stop ever talking about what you don't want to have happen. You only tell your brain what you want to have happen as if it's a done deal. And then it will get on board to help you. And that's just huge. All right. Brains. Hippocrates. I was lecturing about this the other day, and a teenager on the front said, "When did Hippocrates live? Did you know him?" So you never know whether to laugh or not. No, I didn't know him personally. However, he said some wonderful things about the brain. The reason that he thought, underpinned some of the brain function wasn't correct. But he knew there were 4 chunks of cerebral tissue. How did he know that? Maybe he stole a body from the graveyard and dissected the brain. Back then, they didn't really know much. But he knew there were 4 chunks of tissue, and now that we have brain function information, he was absolutely correct. So the beauty of the 21st century is we actually can watch brains while they're functioning. And that's how we learned, for example, how important it is to challenge your brain by reading out loud 10 minutes a day. So let me just digress long enough to tell you that, because on the East Coast, I told them that 2 years ago. Came back to talk to the same group of people, and I said, so how many of you are reading out loud every day? Like 3 hands out of 300 people went up, and I said, and the reason I keep coming back is what? It's a cheap way to age-proof your brain, but you have to do it. So think of my brain as a clock, 12, 6, 9, 3, 2 lines. There's your 4 chunks of cerebral tissue. It's not theoretical, it's anatomical. So they were doing PET scan studies, positron emission tomography, which is when you inject the person with a little glucose, the brain's fuel, that's been tagged radioactively so it'll show up on the computer. So they injected some of this into the veins, and then one by one they put the people in a circular brain camera. And the first thing they asked them was, here, take this paragraph, read it to yourself silently, and watched what happened in the brain. And 3 little tiny pinpoints of light showed up, 1 in each of those 4 chunks, showing that in order to read silently to yourself, it does take the whole brain. Something in each section adds to that ability. And as they were doing the assessments, one of the researchers said, I wonder if anything different would happen if we asked him to read it out loud. I said, I don't know, let's try it. So they said, okay, read that same paragraph, but this time read it out loud. And what do you suppose happened? 80%, 80%, in case you have trouble with my accent, lit up. Hugely complex, stimulating activity to read aloud. Because it's not just the brain itself. Now you have to translate the directions to your tongue and your teeth and your mouth and your jaw and your larynx to get it all out loud. And so that's an anti-aging strategy. I was talking to a group of people and I told them that. And a lady put her hand up and she says, Dr. Taylor, I live alone. I thought, now why in the middle of a seminar would she tell me that? And I smiled and said, thank you, and started to go on. She says, no, wait, I live alone. I said, what would you like me to know about the fact that you live alone? Well, she said, you just told us to read out loud 10 minutes a day, and I'm telling you, I live alone. I said, well, I don't remember saying anything about reading to anybody. Just read aloud. Oh, she said, I couldn't do that. I'd be so embarrassed. I said, I thought you told me you lived alone. Oh, she said, I couldn't do that. And I said, well, your brain can only do what it thinks it can do. So if you don't think you can read aloud by yourself in your house, guess what? It's not going to happen. I said, do you have a pet? Yeah, she says, I have a lovely Persian cat. I said, great. Plop the cat in a chair and read to the cat. She says, I don't think it would understand me. My grandmother used to say, you can't fix stupid. And her definition of stupid was saying ridiculous things. So I don't know whether she's going to stimulate her brain or not, but hopefully you will. So now we know how to take care of the brain. A whole lot more about it. You can go to my website, arlenetaylor.org, look up brain references, whole section on what we know about how to care for the brain. And now we've got even more research about the difference between the male brain and the female brain, and that's what we're talking about this afternoon. And tonight we'll talk about the differences between male humor and female humor, because they're as different as the East is from the West. So I sometimes entitle this Stress in the Female Brain. Not that I want to single out the female, but the brains do very different things. And men, well, women don't even understand it, but certainly men don't. Often I've had couples in my office and they were arguing about something. Arguing is very stressful. You want to avoid going there. But she'll say something like, "Oh, it's just so terribly stressful right now." And he'll come off with something like, "I don't think it's that bad. I mean, come on, just get over it." Well, that's more stress in itself. And here's the reason. Let's talk about the 3 types of stressors first. I'm sure that you know these, so we won't spend long. There's 3 major categories you can dump all stressors into. There's eustress, which is very positive. It helps you grow, learn. I'm under eustress right now because I'm up talking in front of you, and in the United States at least, that's the #1 fear. It even outranks crashing in an airplane. There's distress, which is outright negative stress, which you would avoid if you possibly can. Can't always do that. It involves going bankrupt, being fired, stuff like that. And then there's mistress. Please notice how it's spelled. Mistress. Because the first time I talked about this in public, some lady, I got this far, she said, "I know about that. My husband's had 3. I said, "I think that would be in the category of distress personally, but..." Now, these 2, distress and mistress, unmanaged, literally kill brain cells. And that can contribute to dementia. And by the way, I forgot to mention that this is after lunch. If you feel your mind wandering, get up and move around. We got plenty of room in the back. Because 50% of brains learn best when they're standing and their bodies are moving. Did you know that? So if you got that kind of brain, stand up, not a problem. I'm not visual, I won't see you. Only if you make a lot of noise and knock over a few chairs, then I might kick into that. Stress is a very relative concept, which is the reason I don't do stress management seminars like are usually done. Every thought you think changes the very structure of your brain. So we actually become more dissimilar as we get older because nobody ever thinks the same thoughts. Some of the young people think, "Oh, all those old people are alike." Not even close. Much more different than we were when we were younger. Your stress responses tend to be learned, usually in childhood. So if you had parents who knew how to manage stress well, you were lucky. At least you had the opportunity to watch good stress management techniques, but many parents didn't have clue 1. It relates to 2 things specifically: how you perceive things. Now that goes back to your brain, your mindset. Some people think life is hard and then you die. Well, that's one perspective. Another perspective is I keep learning as I'm getting older, and actually life is getting so much easier. And it really is, because hardly anything bothers me anymore. It's just marvelous. I'm really clear. I only have my own brain's opinion, and that's all you have. So it really doesn't matter what people say to me. I'll pay attention. Thank you, I'll think about it, but it's got nothing to do with me. It came out of somebody else's brain. So there's nothing to get upset about. Lady came up to me the other day and said, when are you going to get a facelift? I thought, boy, white hair really does age you, doesn't it? And I'm starting to chuckle. I mean, who would come up to the speaker and say, when are you going to get a facelift? You know, some people would get angry, get really stressed, you know, go home, contact a doctor, see if they could borrow money for a facelift. And I'm thinking, what would trigger that? Now, a man would never do that. You understand that. If a man thought you needed a facelift, he wouldn't ask a question. He'd just come up and say, go get a facelift. But she asked me a question. When are you getting one? The answer is probably never, but... So I'm thinking, female, must be female speech. Because female speech asks the question to start a conversation. You do know that. So here we go. A man and a woman are driving down the highway. He's driving. Let's see. He'd be on this side. She's over here. She turns to him and she says, are you thirsty? And male speech just answers the question. There's no meta message, he thinks. No, keeps driving. She starts steaming. I mean, stuff's coming out her ears. And half an hour later, she's really mad at him, and she'd get out of the car and just, you know, walk home if it wasn't so far. He's oblivious, completely oblivious. Two women driving down the highway together. One says to the other one, are you thirsty? And she'll go, oh, I haven't thought about it. Let me think, am I thirsty? Yeah, you know, I think I am. Are you thirsty? Well, shall we stop? Should we get something to drink? And 15 minutes later, after a really rousing conversation, they've decided what they're going to drink and where they're going to stop. Not a problem. So I thought, what would trigger her to ask a question? It's got to be the start of a conversation. Wonder if she's had a facelift and wants to talk to me about it and didn't want to just walk up and say, I had a facelift. So I said, well, thank you for your suggestion. I'll think about it. I'll think about anything. Sometimes I actually learn something. Have you had a facelift? And what do you think she said? Yes. I had a facelift 7 months ago. Don't I look wonderful? Fortunately, I know you don't have to answer every question you're asked. Because this is my brain's opinion, just my brain's opinion. If I think somebody is smiling broadly, I'd like to see something on the face move. So whatever you learned about managing stress, if it's not helping you right now, you can relearn it. All brains need effective stress management strategies. You know, stress is just living. Somebody said to me the other day, man, I wish I could get rid of the stress in my life. And I said, well, then you'd be dead. That there are different kinds of stress, and you need to know how to manage them. It's critical for females. Males, listen up. If you've got any females in your family that you care about, you can help them with stress management techniques. It's critical for females because their brains are twice as vulnerable to stress as male brains. We had no idea. Absolutely none. I don't know what your ratio of depression is in Australia, but women in the United States tend to be diagnosed with depression something like 10 to 1. Now that may not mean that the men are not depressed, but now we're realizing that the symptoms that males exhibit when they are depressed are entirely different from the symptoms that females exhibit when they're depressed. So now we got a whole new learning curve to go through, and physicians and healthcare professionals are being educated on what to look for in males because it's different. And now we think we know some of the reasons, and it's so much fun. So the brain is the first body system to recognize a stressor, and it instantly turns on the stress response. And it can stimulate that stress response, meaning the pouring out of adrenaline and cortisol and so on, for up to 72 hours after one stress event. And the stress event can be real, or it can just be all in your head. You know, somebody says to me, when are you going to get a facelift? If I perceive that as a negative and as a stressor, and I rehearse that to everybody I meet in living color and tell them how horrible it was, and who would come up to the speaker and say that? I continually keep triggering the stress response. So I've met people that I don't think have been free of the stress response since before they were born. So the brain stress equation is this. Read aloud with me. 20% of any negative impact to your brain and body is due to the stressor event. 80% is due to your perception of the event. Have you got that? That's amazing. So that comes from work by Epictetus. I remember after I came back from Greece, I was telling a group of people about Epictetus. He had been a slave for years, and apparently he was very valuable, and he didn't want to be a slave, and his owner busted his leg in several places to try to make it so he couldn't escape. And eventually he was freed, don't know how, but he said some wonderful things. This is landmark. He said, it's not so much what happens that matters, it's what you think about what happens that matters. And that's where you get the 80%. I'm really clear and careful to put 2nd century there, because this was another one. I went to Greece and I heard about Epictetus and things that he had said. Did you know him personally? No. And again, because I'm a preacher's kid, you know, all the scriptures I learned come flooding back. Be anxious for what? Nothing. You know, people say to me, well, there's some things you ought to be anxious about. No, nothing. Nothing, because it's so lethal for your brain. You can have something that you're concerned about and move to a solution, but that's different from being anxious about it. So now we call that the 20-80 rule. 20% is due to the event, 80% is due to your perception of the event. So, read with me. Even when you can't do anything about the 20%, you can do almost everything about the 80% because you create your own perceptions. Now, if I didn't know this, I might not be so blasé about someone coming up to me and saying, when are you going to get a facelift? I think it's hysterical. Makes a fabulous story. Not a problem whatsoever. I can't do anything about the fact that she asked me that, but I can do everything about whether or not it bothers me. Rat research. I like to point out that the rat brain is very like the human brain. Did you know that? So when someone calls you a rat, consider it, you know, a compliment. Because rat and human peptides are identical. Peptides are neurotransmitters that affect mood. And they're identical in the rat brain as they are in the human brain, which I think is fascinating. So rats make a good research subject. So researchers never want to just study one group. They always want to compare things. And male and female brains, I mean, what better than comparing those two? So they took a bunch of rats and they wanted to study when they were stressed how differently the male and the female rats handled that. And the way they stressed them is put them in a bucket of water and let them start swimming. And those little rats can sometimes swim for 3 days. 3 days before they decide they've had enough and go under, and then of course you fish them out and so on. So this was recently reported in Molecular Psychiatry, and you can go to the website, the address is here, and you can actually look up the research and read it for yourself. It's understandable, let me read to you, well, you can read with me, the summary of the research, and then I'll try to explain what I think it means in ordinary language. Start here. In response to a stressor, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing factor, or CRF, both a peptide hormone and a neurotransmitter. The CRF binds to receptors on cell surfaces in the locus coeruleus, an alarm center deep in the brain stem. Okay, there's the research. Have you got it? I had to read it a few times myself. But basically, this is what we're talking about. This is a cutaway of the brain. Here's the gray matter cortex cerebrum. Here's the brain stem and the cerebellum. And then here in the middle is the limbic brain, the mammalian brain. This first layer is the reptilian brain, because that's all reptiles have. And the middle is the mammalian brain, which all of us have because we're mammals. And then you come up here to this part of the brain, the cortex, gray matter, cerebrum. Some mammals have part of that, but none of them apparently have this prefrontal cortex right here behind your forehead that clearly distinguishes us from the rest of the animal kingdom. So the hypothalamus is right up here in that middle part of the brain, and it orchestrates a lot. When it perceives a stressor, it starts sending out mega instructions throughout the brain. In the brain stem is where the alarm center lives. That's where you have all of the responses like fight, flight, tend, befriend, conserve, withdraw. Corticotropin releasing factor is an extremely powerful substance because it's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. Now, if you don't understand the significance of that, neurotransmitters tend to work in the brain and the nervous system, which means that they also work in the heart because you have neurons in your heart, and they certainly work in the gastrointestinal system because you've got 1 million+ neurons there. But it'll primarily react on nervous tissue. Hormones, a tiny, minuscule micro drop, is so powerful that it'll affect every cell in your body. So when you've got something that's both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, it's hitting every cell you own. So it becomes very powerful. So when something happens and this alarm center goes off, then there's a little group of cells called the locus coeruleus. Doesn't matter whether you remember that or not. But it's down here in the brain stem. This CRF is extremely powerful. Way more powerful than we realize. So here's some of the things that it can do. When it pours out, it can suppress appetite. You're not interested in food. It can increase subjective anxiety. Just turn it up. It's linked with euphoric feelings that accompany alcoholism, which we did not know. So part of the reason that people struggle to stop drinking alcohol is because when you get alcohol in your system, it's a stressor for the brain. Corticotropin releasing factor is put out, and it kind of tries to help cover up the stress, help you cope with the stress, but it feels good, so the person feels better after they drink. I mean, nobody else around them may be feeling good, but they are. It triggers inflammation. That's one thing you do not want in your brain and body for lots of reasons. It causes joint pain, problems in your heart. It's being investigated in multiple sclerosis research, how whether the body and brain have been putting out a lot of CRF for years and triggering perhaps multiple sclerosis. And this is new. High levels of CRF have been found in the cerebral spinal fluid of individuals who committed suicide. Which means, in plain ordinary language, people only kill themselves when their brain is in an altered state. Got that? And the pain is so great, the only thing they can think of is stopping the pain. High levels of CRF in their cerebral spinal fluid. Most of the people on my mother's side of the family are Catholic. Lots of nuns and priests in our family. My mother used to say, they're good nuns and priests. We have a very small family. Not too many left that aren't nuns and priests. But I do remember when somebody, our neighbor, one of them committed suicide, and they couldn't get buried by the church, because if you commit suicide, you can't be buried on hallowed ground. I hope that's going to change with this information, because people only kill themselves when their brains are in an altered state. And when they're in an altered state, you are not completely responsible for your choices. So here's one neuron in the locus coeruleus, down here in the brain stem. It happens to be a female neuron. And whatever metaphor you want to use, get one so that you can remember this, because it's just amazing. First of all, look at these three little green things here. Remember those. They're not doing diddly in the female brain. Nothing's happening. They're just sitting there, not sure if they're for decoration or what. You see all around the edge of the neuron those blue docking stations. You know, you can imagine this is a lake, and here are all the places where little boats could pull in and gas up and, you know, offload their cargo. So when the CRF is released throughout the brain and body, it goes to the locus coeruleus and it wants to dock and dump its CRF into the cell. Okay, have I said that in a way that makes sense? Up and down means yes. Okay. What that means is this cell has heightened brain's stress reactivity. Every docking station is open, all the CRF is pouring in, this cell is just vibrating. Now here's the male equivalent. Neuron, locus coeruleus. Look at these little green things. Number one, there's more of them. And number two, they're doing something. What are they doing? They're pulling in docking stations. One's in, one's on its way in, this one will be next, and maybe another one or two. What happens when you only have half the number of docking stations, receptor molecules available? Only half as many boats can dock, only half as much CRF gets dumped in. So the male brain has toned down the neuron stress sensitivity because the little green things are working and they're not even taking in the CRF. So in general, this is what happens. The male and the female are confronted with the same type of stressor. He's completely underreacting. It's no big deal, just get over it. She is completely overreacting. Oh, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to us. And when they don't understand what's happening, they will not be able to help each other. So here you see them side by side. Receptors, docking stations, all stay open on the surface of the neuron. Lots of boats can dock. Lots of CRF gets dumped into the cell. Docking stations, some of them, at least half of them, get pulled inside, so there's no place for the boats to dock. And so only about half of the equivalent CRF even gets into the cell. Who knew? So bottom line, female alarm system is more sensitive to stressors and to corticotropin releasing factor, period. Hands down. We learned that, I retired from healthcare in December of 2013, since I was last here in Perth. I tell you, I now understand when people say, I don't know when I had time to work. I love what I'm doing, but I've never been so busy in my whole life. It's just amazing. We worked with people who were coming back from Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, who had post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, fortunately, not everybody who comes back from the military gets PTSD. Maybe 1 in 5, depending where they were stationed. If a male really wants to recover from PTSD and not milking it for, victim, attention and so on, which some people do, if they work really hard on it under a year, I've seen them just really recover from that. When I retired, we were still working with women who had been back for 10 years and were still struggling, trying to recover from PTSD. Now, part of that, admittedly, maybe they chose the victim route, but part of it has to do with how differently their brains respond to CRF. So Deborah Van Gasser, who's doing a lot of this research, said even in the absence of stressors, the female stress signaling system is more sensitive from the start. And we now know, for example, if a woman is pregnant carrying a female fetus, and she has an extremely stressful pregnancy. Maybe she's an unwed mother and the family's embarrassed and they ship her off to Timbuktu all by herself to have the baby. That child's brain will develop differently than it would if she had not been under extreme stress. And that's scary. And if that child after birth is under lots of stress for the first 2 years, the brain will also continue to develop differently, and that woman will be extremely reactive to stress her whole entire life. There's some things that impact male and female fetuses differently, but that's one for the female. So the lack of receptor internalization just means that the brain is not pulling in those docking stations to the internal part of the cell, could translate into impaired ability to cope with high levels of CRF, and we see that in both depression and PTSD. So it's going to, I think, take a little bit of a shift in figuring out how we're going to deal with some of these things now based on this research. So stress is a relative concept in general, but it certainly has a difference in the male brain and the female brain, and that has to do with learned responses, and we've mentioned that often have to do with personal flexibility. Every brain on the planet is different. Do you really get that? Is it just fine whatever anybody says? You may not like it, but you don't have to allow it to stress yourself. The trees that cannot bend in a storm, at least in Canada, got uprooted. And that's basically, think of that in terms of, PTSD is an uprooting. Depression is an uprooting. And it often has to do with flexibility. So we talked about this. Stressors react with the brain in a two-part equation. This single stress management technique, if you get it and if you apply it, can be huge. Because while you can't necessarily do everything about the 20%, sometimes you can. Sometimes you can think ahead and avoid it altogether. But if you can, 20% is nothing compared to 80%. Okay. So Shelley Taylor, I wish we were related. Maybe we are back somewhere or other, because she's doing brilliant work. And I just would love to say, my cousin, Shelley Taylor. This is what she says. Read with me. Whenever you recognize a stressor or perceive a negative interpretation of the event, recall your gold medal moment. What does she mean by that? She means that every one of us have had something happen that we really enjoyed, that was positive, that we felt good about. Go back there in memory the minute you feel stressed and pull up that gold medal moment. What's the reason for that? The brain wants congruence. I'm sure you're familiar with that word. Anybody not know what congruence is? I love it when people understand words. I didn't know what congruence was when I was a girl. You know, if you're trying to tell it to anybody, you know, the way I explain it, it means that the brain wants everything to match. The brain wants everything to be in harmony. Brain does not like conflict. So the minute you get a thought, one of the few things you can control in life is whether you're going to keep thinking that thought or choose to think a different thought. Are you going to take action based on that thought or not? We control that. So, you're in a stress situation and you start, poor me, this is really horrible. Why did it have to happen to me? You know, how come it couldn't happen to somebody else? Life is hard and then you die. Your brain will immediately begin to search your memory banks for every other event in your life that matches this one, because it wants congruence. And pretty soon you're feeling pretty rotten, not only about the event, but about your whole life. When you get a negative thought, if there's any, recognize it. If there's anything you need to learn from it or do with it, fine, but immediately move to a positive thought. Well, you know, it could be worse. I'm really glad that such and such and such and such. The minute you do that, the brain wants congruence. Now what is it looking for in your brain? Every time that something happened good to you. And that actually is part of the 80%. Now it really doesn't seem quite so bad as it did a few minutes ago. So she says, recall it. Think of one now and have it ready to recall as you need it, and that will help you move into the 80%. So I thought we'd finish up this section by a few slides talking about tips for coping with stressors. And I encourage you to read it aloud with me, especially those who haven't already done their 10 minutes of reading aloud today. Let's go. Drive carefully, especially when you are coping with stressors. It's not only cars that can be recalled by their maker. Be careful what you say during episodes of high stress. If you can't be kind, be silent, or at least have the decency to be vague. Never put both feet in your mouth at the same time, or you won't have a leg to stand on. Stop the mad competitive rush. It's the second mouse that gets the cheese. We'll talk about that in the next section. Birthdays are good for you. The more you have, the longer you live. So learn to enjoy them. I have a picture of Jean-Louise Calment, woman who was born in Arles, France. That's how old she was when she died in 1997. I have a picture of her at her 117th birthday. It looks pretty darn good. I can't imagine how they got 117 candles lit and still burning by the time they took the picture. I mean, there must have been a crowd of people lighting candles. But it's pretty amazing to see a birthday cake with 117 candles on it. I mean, that's what I'm aiming for. Not necessarily the candles, but, oh, I had something today. Where's Kay? What did I have? What? Leamington. I'll have to remember that with Lemures. Maybe I can remember that somehow. You know, that was pretty good stuff. That would be in my 20-80 rule, the 20% of what I usually eat, but I was pretty impressed with that. I'm not sure why I thought of that, but let me tell you about cheese. You know, researchers are finding there are some foods that produce addictive-like behaviors. I think it's no surprise for some of us who've worked with addictive behaviors for half a century. But there's really something interesting about dairy cheese. When you eat dairy cheese and it goes through the digestive process, it releases something called casomorphins. Casomorphins are opiates. So it's very easy to become addicted to dairy cheeses, just like any other opiate that you could become addicted to, morphine, whatever. So in studies of people who wanted to develop a more healthful diet, they had a harder time giving up cheese than they did giving up McDonald's, burgers, French fries, fast food. So you might want to factor that into your little bank of knowledge. Read with me. Learn from crayons. Some are sharp, some are pretty, some are dull, some have weird names, and all are different colors, but they all have to live in the same box. I had lots of fun with this back in Birmingham, Alabama. I try to put a little makeup on when I speak, because somebody told me one time, everything about you is the same color. We don't even know if you have eyes when we're sitting in the back. I said, so move up to the front. But nevertheless, man came up to me and he says, what color is your brain? I said, well, it's about the size of your 2 fists. But if you have really big hands, don't get too excited, because intelligence is not about size. It's about how many fingers you have on each neuron and how they connect with other neurons. But if you put a gray glove on your left hand and a white glove on your right hand, that's the color of my brain. He says, so what color is my brain? I said, if you put a gray glove on your left hand and a white glove on your right hand, that's the color of your brain. He says, can't be. And I says, well, it is. But he says, their skin color is different. And I looked at him and I said, oh, so it is. Well, it's got nothing to do with brain color. If we got some of this stuff, we really wouldn't be worried about skin color. I'm no longer worried about the fact that I have none. All right, here we go. Sleep late whenever possible. It's the early worm that gets eaten by the bird. Except that some days you're the pigeon and some days you're the statue. Practice laughter on the days you're the statue. And the last one. The truly happy and typically low-stress personality is the one who can actually enjoy the scenery on a detour. So ask yourself, when I'm on a detour, am I really anxious and worried, or am I enjoying the scenery? Makes all the difference in the world about the way in which you're stressing your brain and body. All right, I'd like you to get up, move around, do whatever you need to do. We'll take a 5 or 10 minute break, and then we'll talk about connectome wiring differences.